You're with Gillian on the Brown Notes, getting through a number of reviews as I've got a backlog again. A Gone But Forgotten review, which came out of nowhere for me, as I didn't have any new music to play on the radio last week, and I suddenly realised I was playing this old album that was pretty much gone but forgotten, which is my infrequent series on usually an album, sometimes a film, sometimes an artist that were denied classic status on release or have been forgotten about since. Nearly both for this one, which is Terry Reid's 1973 album River. It did get some acclaim on release, but not much, and it made no impact whatsoever. So it fits both criteria. One of the most interesting British performers of his era is Terence James Reid from St Notts in England, or Neots, however you pronounce it. He came to prominence in the late 1960s, and his story is one of tragedy, unfortunately. Around the late 60s, he was heralded as one of the next big things. And he was going to go on tour with the Rolling Stones in, I think, 1969, who were the biggest live act in the world at that point. And everyone thought that he was going to be... He had 2 albums out, very sort of wailing, bluesy rock that fitted into that sort of late 60s post-Cream sort of paradigm. And he turned down a couple of gigs, and one of them was when he was asked to become the front person for Led Zeppelin. He turned that down, and he recommended his friend Robert Plant, who he does possess a very similar vocal style to become the singer for Led Zeppelin. And then he turned down Deep Purple. At that particular moment, around 69, it didn't seem like a particularly stupid move, and whether he would have been any good. The great difference between him and most frontmen of hard rock bands is that he is a phenomenal guitarist as well. But at that point, he was deemed to be becoming a solo artist of great renown. And he had some run-ins for a couple of years with, I think, the record label owner Mickey Most, which stopped him releasing his 3rd album for a few years. His career stalled, and he's always been an also-ran guy with a sometimes lauded solo discography, and people have covered his music. His songs have been recorded by the Hollies, Crosby, Stills and Nash, Marianne Faithfull, Cheap Trick, Jack White and the Raconteurs, Chris Cornell, Joe Perry. Lots and lots of people have covered his music. Outside of being a virtuoso guitarist, his nickname was Super Lungs, and that is because he has the most phenomenal wail a la Jimmy Plant. But as an actual singer, he is peerless. One of the greatest British voices of all time. So he did eventually release a 3rd album called River, and he has sporadically released music since then. He's only got probably 4 solo albums going from 1973 to 2016. He's 76, I think, at the moment, 74. River is widely regarded as his masterpiece. I really like the first couple of albums, which are more like collections than proper albums. And there's a really good version of Bang Bang, You Shot Me Down that he does, which is phenomenal. River is a pretty unique album that's very much apart from that sort of Yardbirdsy Cream era of almost driving hard rock blues, in that it's almost an acoustic funk roots album. It's got this weird sort of paradigm that's very, very funky and closer to R&B than the likes of Led Zeppelin or Deep Purple. It's not an out-and-out rock album. It's very short. It's like under 40 minutes. I should point out that they released The Other Side of the River a couple of years ago on Light in the Attic Records, which is a reimagining of the album with different recordings and slightly different track lists. This is the original, which I'm actually going to review here. It kicks off with this wonderful style that occupies at least half the album before it becomes a little bit more cerebral, which is the kind of music that anyone would like. It's extremely soulful, funky, it's rock at the same time. It's got this like chicken scratch, very sort of low-key blues. His voice and both the lower register and the higher register I should just say the softer register and the louder register is just a phenomenon to hear. His vocals throughout this album showcase what a beautifully emotive voice he had, even softly singing and then erupting into these screaming hard rock choruses. But that's not the music on display here. He seems to have an inordinate amount of control over being able to deliver those shrieks in an environment where there's no real hard rock going on at all. One of the most important elements here, the band he's got are phenomenal. Willie Bobo is a jazz Latin drummer of great renown going back 20 years before this album. Him drumming on the album throughout means that we get virtually nothing that's four to the floor rock beats ever. The syncopation of the percussion throughout is one of the revelations of the album. And the bass playing by Lee Miles as well continually pops out of the soundstage. It sounds like the best bar band you've ever heard. And the other key element is the guitarist David Lindley, who's played with a ridiculous amount of famous people up to the likes of Bruce Springsteen and Linda Ronstadt, but hundreds. He is a virtuoso across dozens of different string instruments. And given that Terry Reid's also a fantastic electric guitarist, the acoustic and electric guitaring on this album is phenomenal. And I think the second track, Avenue, really showcases David Lindley's fondness for the guitar slide method of playing. It does remind me a tiny bit of early ZZ Top, if you've ever heard the tremendous album Tres Hombres. And there is a lot of variations on how string instruments are presented on this. It really doesn't sound anything like Led Zeppelin or Deep Purple, even though he's a singer that could easily have done both. The acoustic riffing on the opening of Things to Try is incredibly complicated. And it's got this amazingly light verse groove going on, which sounds fantastic. Almost a little bit of a chug that reminded me of Creedence Clearwater Revival. I'd say out of all of the bands you could compare them to for this album, it's probably closer to an acoustic, semi-acoustic version of Creedence than it would be to, say, the Stones, who might be next at times. But nothing like anything that was coming out of the hard rock pool. There's the Live Life track, has the first sort of full chord chug rather than like picking or slide. The first four tracks are all sort of variants on a similar soundstage and musical style, which is very appealing. It's sort of like this middle ground between, almost like the album, which I absolutely adore, and I should do a review of, Sweet Child by Pentangle, where they were folk, but at the same time they were in this middle ground between blues, R&B, folk, and rock. And that's kind of where their first sort of four or so tracks sit. Some great staccato picking on the guitar and some really nice chaotic breakdowns. It's probably the closest to full-out folk. The title track, River, is sort of like the first sort of introduction of music very analogous to this, which is the swamp blues of someone like Dr. John, that sort of neon New Orleans blues that he pioneered on albums like Gree, which is a masterpiece as well, and the bossa nova style rhythm on it as well. And we also get him sing. His voice in its softer register is amazingly feminine at times, and some of the chord changes and key changes are incredibly difficult, and his voice is completely wedded to following everything that is thrown at it throughout. It's probably the best showcase, that track River, for his amazing virtuosity as a vocalist. And then it becomes, I saw someone say that this was in a realm of astral weeks, which I totally disputed, but as the songs sort of modulate away from that bar band R&B blues folk rock of the openers, it becomes a much more cerebral album. So I did kind of get that vibe in the later tracks. So Dream itself, very soft acoustic ballad, almost reminding me of something like you would get from a Carly Simon or a Carole King album. Very emotive singing, and it sounds like everything's a bit more cerebral. And it gets even softer on the final track, Milestones, which sort of fades into this very late night jazz, almost Nick Drake wisp. And it's got the only track on the album with more than one voice being heard, as I think they chorus up his own vocals to add layers into the background. And the producer, Tom Dowd, was an iconic producer as well, one of the most influential from that whole genre. So it's a really interesting album. Had it just been the funk blues stuff, it's the kind of music that anyone at all would listen to. And it does evolve into something a bit more cerebral by the end. It's very well put together. It doesn't overstay its welcome on any track. The playing is exceptional, and the string instrumentation and drumming is phenomenal. And even better is the singing of Terry Reid, which is just absolutely peerless. It's above the likes of peak Robert Plant. And he's able to control him, like the emotion that he does with his softer register is unparalleled. It becomes very, very sort of female sounding at times. And he bends so much emotion into it, like David Gilmour playing the guitar sort of manages to bend in emotion. So a fantastic album by a still living Terry Reid, who gets to be known as the guy that passed up Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple, but has a cult fan base, and River's probably the best introduction to his music and a phenomenal album. So 9.5 out of 10 for 1973's River.